6 German fighters closing in from above. No altitude, no speed, no angle of escape. The Polish pilot glanced at his instruments and did something no flight manual had ever sanctioned. He pulled the stick hard left and kicked the rudder in the opposite direction. The Spitfire shuddered, twisted, and vanished from their gun sights. 15 seconds later, all 6 attackers broke formation in confusion. What they had just witnessed was aerodynamically impossible. August 1940. The sky over southern England belonged to whoever could hold it longest. German bombers came in waves, escorted by fighters that outnumbered the Royal Air Force nearly 3-1. Every afternoon brought the same calculus of survival: climb, intercept, fire, evade. Most pilots died before mastering the sequence. The ones who lived long enough to be called veterans were often dead within a fortnight. Luck mattered. Ammunition mattered. But in the cramped cockpit of a Spitfire or Hurricane, one variable mattered most: energy management. Speed translated to altitude. Altitude translated to position. Position meant living long enough to fire or flee. Lose your energy in a dogfight and you became a target with wings. The Luftwaffe understood this. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbed faster and dove harder than anything the British had. German pilots exploited that advantage with a tactic called boom and zoom. Dive from altitude, fire a burst, then climb away before the enemy could react. RAF doctrine trained pilots to turn and fight, to stick with an enemy through a turning battle until someone made a mistake. But what happened when there was no time to turn? What happened when 6 fighters had already committed to the kill and you were alone, low and slow? The answer, for most pilots, was a shallow grave in the English countryside or a watery disappearance over the Channel. But one man rewrote that answer. His name was Witold Urbanowicz, and he did not fly like the others. He was 30 years old, a former instructor, and a Polish exile who had fled across Europe with nothing but his logbook and a borrowed uniform. He had watched his country dissolve in 5 weeks under the combined weight of 2 invasions. He had flown until his squadron ran out of fuel, then walked through forests and across borders to keep flying. By the time he arrived in England, he had logged more combat hours than most RAF squadron leaders, but combat hours were not the same as survival. The Royal Air Force grouped Polish pilots into their own squadrons, partly out of respect, partly out of logistics. Language barriers and unfamiliar radio protocols made integration difficult, so the Poles flew together under British command in British aircraft with one unspoken understanding: they had nothing left to lose. That made them dangerous in ways the Luftwaffe had not anticipated. Urbanowicz joined 303 Squadron in late July, just as the air battles over the Channel intensified into what the British would later call the Battle of Britain. He was made a flight commander within days, not because of rank or seniority, but because he understood something fundamental about the geometry of air combat. He understood that the rules were not laws. They were suggestions written by men who had never been outnumbered 6-1 with no way out. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Before the war, Witold Urbanowicz had been a meticulous student of flight physics. He earned his wings in 1932 at the Polish Air Force Academy in Dęblin, where the curriculum emphasized aerobatics and precision formation flying. Instructors drilled into cadets the importance of coordinated flight, stick and rudder inputs working together to produce clean, controlled maneuvers. Skidding and slipping were errors to be corrected, not techniques to be explored. But Urbanowicz had a habit of testing edges. During training flights, he would climb high over empty fields and deliberately induce a skid, holding the aircraft in uncoordinated flight to see how it responded. He wanted to know what the aircraft could do when pushed beyond the manual's comfort zone. He logged the sensations: the buffet in the controls, the sluggish roll response, the way the nose wandered when rudder and stick fought each other. His instructors tolerated it because his formal scores were flawless. By the time he became an instructor himself, he had developed an unusual teaching philosophy. He told his students to master coordinated flight first, then learn how to break coordination intentionally. Control, he believed, came from knowing what happened when you violated the rules. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Urbanowicz was stationed with the 114th Fighter Squadron near Krakow. He flew the PZL P-11, a gull-winged fighter that was already obsolete. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt 109s outclassed it in speed, firepower, and ceiling. Polish pilots compensated with aggression and creativity. Urbanowicz claimed his first kill on the third day of the war. A Dornier bomber caught low over a supply column. He attacked from below, where the gunner's field of fire was poorest, and fired until the bomber's engine streamed black smoke. It fell into a field east of the Vistula. 2 days later, he shot down a Heinkel reconnaissance plane using the same tactic. But on September 6th, he learned what happened when creativity met overwhelming numbers. His squadron was scrambled to intercept a formation of 50 bombers escorted by 30 fighters. There were 8 Polish aircraft. They climbed into the formation and fired until their ammunition ran out. Urbanowicz saw 2 of his wingmen go down in flames. He nursed his damaged P-11 back to base, with a dead engine and hydraulic fluid leaking into the cockpit. The squadron relocated twice that week, retreating ahead of German armored columns. By mid-September, there were no functional airfields left. Urbanowicz and the surviving pilots destroyed their remaining aircraft and fled east, hoping to regroup in Romania. Instead, the Soviet Union invaded from the opposite direction. Poland ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Urbanowicz walked south through the Carpathian Mountains, crossed into Romania, then bribed his way onto a train heading west. He carried forged papers and a letter from a dead squadron mate's family. Reached France in October, joined the reconstituted Polish Air Force in exile, and flew patrols during the Phoney War. When France collapsed in June 1940, he escaped to England aboard a destroyer crammed with evacuees. He arrived with no possessions except his flight logs and a borrowed watch. The Royal Air Force assigned him to 303 Squadron at RAF Northolt, just outside London. The squadron was still forming, its pilots a mix of veterans and younger airmen who had fled through the same desperate routes. Many spoke limited English. Some had never flown a Spitfire. Urbanowicz spent his first week learning the aircraft's handling characteristics. It was faster and more responsive than anything he had flown, but also less forgiving. The Merlin engine had a tendency to cut out under negative G-forces, a dangerous quirk in combat. He memorized the fuel system, the gun sight calibration, and the radio frequencies. And he began testing once again the edges of coordinated flight. By mid-August, the Luftwaffe shifted its strategy. Instead of attacking coastal convoys, German bombers began targeting RAF airfields and sector stations. The goal was to destroy fighter command on the ground, clearing the way for invasion. The raids came in large formations, 50 to 70 bombers escorted by twice as many fighters. RAF squadrons scrambled to intercept, but they were almost always outnumbered. The mathematics were brutal. A single squadron consisted of 12 aircraft. A typical interception meant 12 British fighters engaging a formation of over 100 German aircraft. Pilots had seconds to position, fire, and disengage before enemy escorts swarmed them. Most attacks were single passes: dive into the bomber stream, fire a 2-second burst, then dive away before the escorts could react. Staying to dogfight was suicide. But sometimes there was no choice. Sometimes the escorts were already there, waiting above, and the only option was to fight or die. Urbanowicz experienced this on August 30th. His flight of 4 Spitfires climbed to intercept a raid heading toward Biggin Hill Airfield. They spotted the bombers at 12,000 feet, a formation of Dornier 17s stacked in tight Vics, surrounded by Messerschmitt 109's flying top cover. Urbanowicz called out the position and led his flight into a shallow dive, aiming for the rear of the bomber formation. They closed to 300 yards before the escorts reacted. The 109s rolled and dove, cutting off the Spitfire's escape route. Urbanowicz fired at a Dornier, saw strikes along the fuselage, then pulled hard left as tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. A 109 locked onto his tail. He pushed the throttle forward and dove, gaining speed, but the Messerschmitt matched him. Another bandit appeared ahead, cutting across his nose. 2 more dropped from above. Within seconds, Urbanowicz was surrounded. The textbook response was to brake hard in one direction and try to outturn the attackers. Spitfires could turn tighter than 109s at lower speeds, but he was already low on energy. A hard turn would bleed off his remaining speed, leaving him a stationary target. Climbing was impossible. The Germans held every altitude advantage. Running straight meant offering a steady firing solution to the fighter on his tail. There was no good option. Conventional tactics assumed you had room to maneuver, time to react, or altitude to trade. Urbanowicz had none of those. He was a slow target in a shrinking box with 6 guns pointed at him. So he did something the Luftwaffe pilots did not expect. He broke every rule of coordinated flight. The maneuver had no official name. Urbanowicz had never performed it in combat. He had tested it at altitude, alone, over empty training ranges, out of pure curiosity about what happened when you commanded an aircraft to do 2 contradictory things at once. A Spitfire, like any aircraft, wanted to fly coordinated. The stick controlled pitch and roll. The rudder controlled yaw. In a normal turn, you banked with the stick and added rudder to keep the nose tracking smoothly through the turn. If you used too much rudder, the nose skidded outward. If you used opposite rudder while banking, the aircraft slipped sideways through the air, nose pointing one direction while the flight path went another. Slips were used to lose altitude quickly during landing approaches. They were not used in combat. They were slow, mushy, and uncontrolled. But Urbanowicz had discovered that if you induced a slip violently enough, at the edge of a stall, the aircraft did something unexpected. It rotated. Not around the longitudinal axis like a barrel roll, and not around the vertical axis like a flat spin. It snapped laterally, tail swapping ends with the nose almost instantly, driven by the asymmetric airflow over the wings and fuselage. The result was a near instantaneous change in heading with almost no forward movement. To an observer, it looked like the aircraft simply disappeared from its projected flight path and reappeared pointing a different direction. The risk was catastrophic. If the aircraft fully stalled during the maneuver, it would enter an uncontrolled spin with insufficient altitude to recover. If the G-forces exceeded the airframe's limits, the wings would fold. If the pilot misjudged the rudder input, the aircraft would tumble inverted and plunge. It was not a combat maneuver. It was a desperation physics experiment. But desperation was all Urbanowicz had. He told himself later that he did not consciously decide to attempt it. His hands moved before his mind finished calculating the risk. He pulled the stick hard left, banking the Spitfire into what looked like a standard left turn. Then he stomped the right rudder pedal to the floor. The aircraft shuddered. The controls went mushy. The horizon spun. The Spitfire snapped 90 degrees right, nose swapping violently, then dropped into a steep side-slip. The German fighters, anticipating a left turn, fired into the space where Urbanowicz should have been. Their rounds passed through empty air. By the time they corrected, he was no longer in front of them. He had slipped perpendicular to his original flight path, then rolled wings level and dove. The whole sequence took less than 3 seconds. The Luftwaffe pilots broke formation, searching for the Spitfire that had just vanished. One 109 overshot and climbed away. Another pulled hard right, overshooting in the opposite direction. The remaining 4 scattered, unable to reacquire a target that had violated their predictive models of how aircraft move through space. Urbanowicz leveled out 50 feet above the ground, hedge-hopping southeast toward Northolt. His fuel was low, his hands were shaking, but he was alive. Back at base, he said nothing about the maneuver. There was no language for it in the RAF's tactical vocabulary. He filed a standard combat report. Engaged multiple hostiles, evaded, returned to base. The intelligence officer noted his survival against 6 attackers, but attributed it to luck and aggressive flying. Urbanowicz did not correct him. He knew what he had done, and he knew he would need to do it again. September brought the heaviest fighting of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched mass raids on London, flying during the day in formations so large they appeared on radar as solid blocks. RAF squadrons flew 4 and 5 sorties per day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm. Pilots fell asleep in their cockpits between scrambles. Ground crews worked through the night patching bullet holes and replacing damaged engines. Losses mounted. 303 Squadron lost 3 pilots in the first week of September. 2 were shot down over Kent. 1 bailed out with severe burns and never returned to duty. Urbanowicz was promoted to acting squadron leader. He flew nearly every mission, leading flights into formations that outnumbered him 10-1. He refined the slip-snap maneuver during each engagement, testing variables. Airspeed mattered. Below 180 miles per hour, the aircraft stalled before completing the rotation. Above 250, the G-forces approached structural limits. Bank angle mattered. Too shallow and the snap was sluggish. Too steep and the aircraft tumbled. Rudder timing mattered most. The pedal had to be slammed to the stop at the precise moment the aircraft reached maximum bank, just before the stall buffet began. A half-second early, and the maneuver became a clumsy skid. A half-second late, and the wings quit flying altogether. He taught the maneuver to no one. It was too dangerous to demonstrate, too difficult to explain, and too easy to kill yourself attempting. But other pilots in 303 Squadron began noticing that Urbanowicz survived engagements that should have been fatal. On September 15th, a day the RAF would later designate Battle of Britain Day, Urbanowicz led his flight into the largest raid of the war. Over 200 German bombers escorted by 300 fighters crossed the Channel in 2 waves. Every available RAF squadron was scrambled. Urbanowicz intercepted the first wave south of London. He attacked a formation of Heinkel 111s head-on, a tactic that gave the bombers less time to return fire. He closed to 200 yards and fired a 4-second burst. The Heinkel's port engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and fell. Urbanowicz pulled up and found himself alone, separated from his flight, with 4 Messerschmitt 110s closing from his left. The 110 was a twin-engine heavy fighter, slower than the 109 but more stable as a gun platform. 4 of them firing in sequence created a cone of bullets difficult to evade. Urbanowicz turned into them, forcing a head-on pass, then snapped left using the slip maneuver as they flashed past. The 110s broke in confusion. One pilot, expecting the Spitfire to continue its turn, fired into empty air and collided with his wingman. Both aircraft spiraled down trailing smoke. Urbanowicz dove away before the remaining two could regroup. He landed at Northolt with 12 rounds of ammunition remaining. His aircraft had taken 3 hits, one through the rudder, one through the wingtip, and one that punched through the fuselage 6 inches behind his seat. He climbed out, inspected the damage, and requested the aircraft be repaired and ready for the next scramble. The ground crew stared at him. One mechanic asked how he had survived 4 110s alone. Urbanowicz shrugged and said something in Polish that the mechanic did not understand. Later, another pilot translated. He had said, "I made them chase something that wasn't there." By the end of September, Urbanowicz was credited with 15 confirmed kills. 303 Squadron had the highest kill ratio of any RAF unit, downing 126 enemy aircraft in 6 weeks. The numbers were verified by gun camera footage, wreckage analysis, and corroborating witness reports. But the statistics did not capture the real story. The real story was in the negative space. The bullets that missed, the attacks that failed, the kills the Luftwaffe did not achieve because one pilot had learned to break the geometry of pursuit. On October 5th, Urbanowicz performed the maneuver in front of witnesses. He was leading a section of 2 Spitfires on patrol over Maidstone when they encountered 8 Messerschmitt 109s escorting a reconnaissance plane. The Germans had altitude and numbers. Urbanowicz radioed his wingman to stay high and cover, then dove alone toward the rear of the formation. He fired at the reconnaissance plane, missed, and immediately found himself boxed in by 4 109s. His wingman watched from above as Urbanowicz's Spitfire banked hard left, then snapped laterally to the right and dropped like a stone. The pursuing 109s broke in 4 directions, their formation collapsing. Urbanowicz pulled out of the dive, climbed back to altitude, and rejoined his wingman as if nothing unusual had happened. That evening, the wingman described what he had seen to the rest of the squadron. He used his hands to demonstrate the impossible turn, the lateral snap, the instantaneous change in heading. Other pilots listened, skeptical. One asked if Urbanowicz had been hit and lost control. The wingman shook his head. It was deliberate, controlled, and it had saved his life. Someone asked Urbanowicz to explain it. He declined. He said only that the Spitfire could do things the manual did not mention, and that survival often depended on doing what the enemy thought was impossible. The Luftwaffe never adapted. Their tactical doctrine remained built around predictable geometry, pursuit curves, deflection angles, lead calculations. German pilots were trained to anticipate where an enemy aircraft would be based on its speed, bank angle, and turn radius. They fired at a projected point in space, not at the aircraft itself. The slip-snap maneuver invalidated those projections. It introduced an unpredictable variable into an otherwise deterministic system. By late October, the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing. Daylight raids had become unsustainable. Fighter command had held. The invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely, then quietly abandoned. Historians would later attribute the outcome to radar, the skill of RAF pilots, and the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Dowding. All of those factors mattered, but survival in air combat often came down to individuals doing unrepeatable things under unrepeatable circumstances. Urbanowicz flew 180 combat sorties during the Battle of Britain. He was credited with 17 confirmed kills and several probables. He was awarded the Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest military honor, and the British Distinguished Flying Cross. But numbers and medals did not capture the influence of the maneuver itself. Other pilots in 303 Squadron began experimenting with uncoordinated flight, not the full slip-snap, which remained too dangerous for most to attempt, but subtler variations. Using rudder to skid during a turn, creating a mismatch between where the aircraft pointed and where it traveled. slipping sideways during a dive to throw off a pursuer's aim. These techniques spread quietly through the Polish squadrons, then to a few British units whose pilots flew alongside them. There was no official documentation, no training manual included them, but they became part of the unwritten curriculum of survival. After the battle, Urbanowicz was assigned to train new pilots. He taught them energy management, gunnery, and tactical formation flying. He did not teach them the slip-snap maneuver. When asked why, he said it was not something that could be taught. It required a kind of trust in the aircraft that only came from testing its limits alone, at altitude, with room to fail. In 1941, Urbanowicz was sent to the Soviet Union as part of a liaison mission. In 1943, he traveled to the United States and flew combat missions in the Pacific with the American 14th Air Force. He downed 2 Japanese fighters over China, bringing his total confirmed kills to 19. After the war, he remained in the United States. Poland was under Soviet occupation, and returning meant imprisonment or worse. He became a civilian flight instructor, then an aerospace consultant. He rarely spoke about the war. When aviation historians interviewed him decades later, they asked about the maneuver. He acknowledged it, but downplayed its importance. He said it was simply a product of desperation and curiosity, nothing more. But the physics told a different story. In the 1980s, aerodynamicists studying combat maneuvers analyzed descriptions of the slip-snap and concluded it was theoretically possible, but extraordinarily dangerous. The maneuver exploited the Spitfire's relatively low wing loading and powerful rudder authority. Modern fighter aircraft with higher wing loading and fly-by-wire systems could not perform it. It was a technique made possible by the specific characteristics of a specific aircraft flown by a pilot willing to operate at the edge of control. The Luftwaffe never documented encountering the maneuver. German after-action reports from the Battle of Britain occasionally note instances of enemy aircraft disappearing or evading in an unorthodox manner, but no tactical analysis was conducted. The phenomenon was attributed to pilot error or optical illusion. By the time the Germans might have studied it systematically, the air war had moved on. Witold Urbanowicz died in New York in 1996 at the age of 86. His obituary in American newspapers mentioned his wartime service and his work as an instructor. The New York Times noted his 19 confirmed kills. None mentioned the maneuver that had saved his life and the lives of those who learned from him. In Poland, he is remembered differently. Streets and schools bear his name. The Polish Air Force Museum in Krakow displays his logbook and decorations. Veterans of 303 Squadron, in interviews recorded before their deaths, described him as the most precise pilot they had ever flown with. Precision, they said, not aggression. He flew as if he had calculated every variable before the engagement began. But precision is only part of the story. The other part is willingness. Willingness to test what the manual said was impossible. Willingness to violate coordination when coordination meant death. Willingness to trust physics over doctrine. The slip-snap maneuver was never officially recognized as a tactic. It exists in the historical record only as scattered anecdotes and second-hand descriptions, but its legacy is measurable. Urbanowicz survived the war, so did many of the pilots who flew with him, and survival, in the calculus of air combat, was the only victory that mattered. There is a broader lesson in this. Wars are won by institutions, logistics, and strategy. But they are fought by individuals who encounter problems the institutions never anticipated. Sometimes the solution is not in the manual. Sometimes it is in the space between what is taught and what is possible, between what is safe and what is necessary. Urbanowicz understood that space. He lived in it every time he climbed into the cockpit. And when 6 fighters closed in with no room to turn and no time to think, He relied not on training or luck, but on a deep, practiced knowledge of what his aircraft could do when the rules no longer applied. The maneuver itself is now a historical curiosity, a footnote in the aerodynamics of desperation. But the principle endures. The edge of control is where survival lives, and sometimes the only way forward is to do what everyone else believes is impossible. Pacific Theater, 1943. A lone American fighter is being chased by 3 Zeros. He should be dead. His propeller is set beyond manufacturer limits. His engine screams at a pitch that shouldn't exist. But he's pulling away. 18 knots faster than doctrine says is possible. The enemy falls back, confused. Later, his squadron commander will demand an explanation. What he hears will spark the most controversial performance modification of the air war. The summer of 1943 hangs heavy over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Heat radiates off the Marston matting in shimmering waves. The air smells of aviation fuel, burnt oil, and rotting jungle vegetation. Corsairs and wildcats sit in revetments carved from coral and earth, their cowlings open like the mouths of sleeping predators. This is where boys become veterans in a matter of weeks, or they don't come back at all. The Marine squadrons operating out of Henderson face a mathematical problem that no amount of bravery can solve. Japanese Zeros are lighter, more maneuverable at low speeds, and flown by pilots who've been at war since 1937. American fighters carry heavier armament and better protection, but in a turning fight, weight is a death sentence. The tactical doctrine is clear. Boom and zoom. Use altitude and speed to dive on the enemy, fire, and climb away before they can respond. Never try to turn with a Zero. Never let the fight slow down. It works when everything goes according to plan. But over the Solomon Islands, nothing goes according to plan. Weather fronts roll in without warning. Navigation errors scatter formations. Radio failures leave pilots alone in an empty sky, fuel gauges ticking toward zero, with no idea which direction leads home. And when a Zero gets on your tail, doctrine becomes a prayer you repeat while deciding whether to bail out or fight. The mechanics at Henderson work 18-hour shifts in conditions that would shut down a stateside airfield. Humidity corrodes electrical contacts overnight. Coral dust clogs air filters. Hydraulic seals rot in the heat. Every plane that lands is a puzzle of damage and wear that needs solving before dawn. They do their work by the book. Propeller pitch settings, engine temperatures, manifold pressures. All cross-checked against technical orders issued by Pratt & Whitney, by Chance Vought, by the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. These manuals represent tens of thousands of engineering hours. They exist to keep pilots alive and engines from tearing themselves apart. But the book was written in Connecticut, not in the jungle, not in combat, not when 3 Zeros appear out of a cloud bank and the only thing between you and the ocean is whether your plane can go faster than theirs. The pilots feel it first. A gap between what the manual promises and what the air war demands. A sense that their planes have more to give if only someone would let them push harder. They talk about it in the tents at night, voices low, comparing notes on climbs and dives, on moments when the throttle was full forward and it still wasn't enough. Some of them begin to experiment. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. His name was Lieutenant Charles Lindbergh. Not that one, but close enough that it required explanation his entire life. Charles A. Lindbergh, Marine Corps Reserve, fighter pilot. Call sign, Lindy 2. A stocky Midwesterner from Ohio with a degree in mechanical engineering from Purdue and a temperament that instructors described as methodical to a fault. Before the war, he worked for a farm equipment manufacturer in Dayton. His job involved solving problems that didn't have obvious solutions. Why a thresher belt kept snapping under load, why a tractor engine ran rich at altitude, the kind of troubleshooting that required patience, observation, and a willingness to question the manual. He joined the Marines in early 1941, drawn not by warrior mythology but by a quiet certainty that the country would need people who understood machines under stress. His flight instructors noted that he lacked natural aggression but demonstrated exceptional situational awareness. He thought 3 steps ahead. He adjusted his technique based on feedback. He asked questions about performance margins that most cadets didn't know existed. By the time he arrived at Henderson in May of 1943, he'd logged over 400 combat hours, 7 confirmed kills. A reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home when others would have ditched. His squadron mates respected him. They didn't call him fearless. They called him careful. Careful in a way that kept you alive. He had a habit of debriefing himself on paper after every mission: fuel consumption, time to altitude, rate of climb, true airspeed at various manifold pressures. Most pilots relied on instinct and muscle memory. Lindbergh treated his Corsair like a laboratory. Every flight generated data. Every dogfight revealed something about the gap between theoretical performance and actual capability. He noticed patterns. At certain altitudes, with certain power settings, the plane responded with more authority than the performance charts predicted. Other configurations felt sluggish, as if the engine and propeller weren't synchronized. He began correlating these observations with propeller pitch settings, the angle of the blades, the bite they took out of the air. Propeller pitch is a compromise. Too fine, and the blades spin fast but generate little thrust, like a car in first gear at highway speed. Too coarse, and the engine bogs down, trying to turn blades that are biting off more air than it can chew. The engineers calculated an optimal range, a sweet spot that balanced efficiency, engine stress, and performance. But optimal for what? For cruise? For climb? For the moment when you're at full throttle, low on fuel, and a zero is closing from 6 o'clock? Lindbergh started testing at the margins. Small adjustments, a few degrees coarser than the book recommended, then a few more. He paid attention to engine temperature, to vibration, to the sound of the Pratt and Whitney R2800 under load. He learned to hear the difference between an engine working hard and an engine being damaged. He found something. At a specific propeller setting, notably coarser than standard doctrine allowed, the Corsair delivered a measurable increase in top speed. Not theoretical, not a trick of the airspeed indicator, real velocity, the kind you could feel in your bones when the nose dropped and the world started blurring past the canopy. 18 knots. It doesn't sound like much. In a car, it's the difference between 60 and 70 miles per hour. Noticeable, but not transformative. In aerial combat, it was the difference between life and death. 18 knots meant you could disengage from a fight before the enemy closed to firing range. It meant you could extend away, gain distance, climb, and reset the engagement on your terms. It meant you stopped being prey. But the setting existed outside approved limits. It subjected the engine to stresses the manufacturer hadn't certified. It violated technical orders. And if anything went wrong, if an engine failed, if a propeller threw a blade, there would be an investigation, a board of inquiry, a career ended or worse. Lindbergh tested it alone first, then with one other pilot he trusted, then carefully with 2 more. They compared airspeed readings. They monitored engine performance over hours of flight time. They found no degradation, no failures, just speed. By mid-1943, the air war over the Solomons had become a brutal equation. American production was overwhelming Japanese logistics, but Japanese pilots still held tactical advantages in specific engagement profiles. The Zero's turning radius remained unmatched. Its climb rate at low altitude was superior, and its pilots, though fewer and more exhausted than in 1941, still possessed hard-won expertise. American doctrine compensated with energy tactics. Stay fast, stay high, use weight and horsepower to dominate the vertical fight, but doctrine assumed you had the altitude advantage to begin with. It assumed you saw the enemy first. It assumed your flight lead didn't get shot down in the opening pass, leaving you alone and defensive. When those assumptions failed, speed became the only card left to play. Marine squadrons at Henderson were losing planes in engagements where the enemy never should have caught them. Corsairs jumped during the climb to altitude, Wildcats intercepted during ferry flights, damaged aircraft limping home, run down by Zeros that shouldn't have been able to close the gap. The after-action reports piled up. Recommendations were filed. Requests were made for faster aircraft, better early warning, more support. The responses came back in the language of logistics and production schedules. New models were in development. Improved radars were being deployed. Reinforcements were en route. But men were dying now. This week. Today. Lindbergh watched the numbers. He attended the intelligence briefings. He listened to the pilots who came back shaken, describing how they'd done everything right and still barely escaped. He saw the empty cots, the gear packed up and shipped home, and he knew he had a solution that no one had asked for. The problem was institutional. The Navy and Marine Corps operated on a principle of standardized procedures. Every pilot flew the same way. Every mechanic followed the same manual. This created reliability. It allowed replacement pilots to integrate into squadrons without retraining. It ensured that when you radioed for help, you knew exactly what performance to expect from the planes responding. Deviation from standard was not innovation. It was a breakdown in discipline. Lindbergh understood this. He'd been trained in this system. He respected its logic. But he also understood that systems designed in peacetime often failed to account for the variables of combat. The engineers at Pratt & Whitney had built safety margins into their specifications. Conservative estimates designed to cover every possible operating condition, including poor maintenance, low-quality fuel, and pilot error. But Henderson Field had excellent mechanics. The fuel, though scarce, was high-grade, and the pilots were not making errors. They were making life-or-death decisions in a split second, and the calculus of those decisions depended on knowing exactly how much performance their aircraft could deliver. What if the safety margins were too conservative? What if the engines could handle more stress than the manuals allowed? What if an unauthorized setting, tested carefully and monitored rigorously, could give an entire squadron the edge it needed to survive? He ran the numbers. He calculated engine hours to failure. He reviewed metallurgy reports on propeller blade stress. He consulted with the senior mechanic, a grizzled aviation chief named Magruder, who'd been wrenching on Navy planes since before the war. Magruder listened. He didn't dismiss it outright, but he didn't embrace it either. He told Lindbergh that if even one engine failed because of the modification, the blame would roll downhill onto every mechanic who touched that plane. Courts-martial, dishonorable discharges, men with families losing their pensions because a pilot wanted to fly outside the envelope. Lindbergh asked what would happen if they didn't make the change, and more pilots died. Magruder had no answer for that. The spark came not from a dogfight, but from a ferry mission, late July 1943. Lindbergh was tasked with delivering a replacement Corsair from Espiritu Santo to Henderson Field. Solo flight, 400 nautical miles over open ocean. Weather was deteriorating. A tropical depression was moving through the region, bringing heavy cloud cover and intermittent rain squalls. Standard procedure was to fly at 8,000 feet above most of the weather and navigate by dead reckoning with periodic sunshots when the clouds broke. Lindbergh climbed to altitude, set his propeller to cruise pitch per the manual, and settled in for 2.5 hours of tedium. 40 minutes into the flight, he spotted them. 3 dark shapes against a cloud bank, 5 miles out and slightly above. They adjusted course toward him. Not friendly. He was alone. No wingman. No radio support. The nearest Allied airfield was over 200 miles behind him. Henderson was still an hour and a half ahead, and he was in a ferry configuration, which meant reduced ammunition and no external tanks to drop for better performance. The Zeros closed. They had the altitude advantage, and they knew it. Lindbergh pushed the throttle forward and nosed into a shallow dive to build speed. He ran through his options. He couldn't outclimb them. He couldn't turn with them. He couldn't fight 3-on-1 and expect to survive. His only chance was to extend, to build enough of a speed advantage that they'd break off the pursuit before they got into firing range. He watched the airspeed indicator climb. 200 knots, 220, 235. The Corsair was fast, but not fast enough. The Zeros were still closing. Slowly, but closing. He reached down and adjusted the propeller control, pushed it forward into course pitch, past the recommended cruise setting, past the combat power setting, into the red zone that the manual warned against except in emergencies. The R-2800 roared, the blade angle changed, biting deeper into the airstream. The plane surged, 240 knots, 245, 253. The Zeros began to fall back. Lindbergh held the setting. He monitored cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, manifold pressure. Everything stayed within limits. The engine wasn't happy, but it wasn't failing. And with every second, the distance between him and the enemy grew. After 10 minutes, the Zeros gave up. They turned back toward their own base, unwilling to burn fuel chasing a target that was simply faster. Lindbergh flew the rest of the way to Henderson at standard settings. When he landed, he taxied to the revetment, shut down, and sat in the cockpit for a long time. The propeller ticked as it cooled. The smell of hot oil filled the air. He'd just proven something. Not in a controlled test, not in a safe environment with observers and instruments, but in the only laboratory that mattered, combat. That evening he wrote up a detailed report. He documented the engagement, the settings he used, the performance he observed, and the engine parameters throughout. He calculated the speed differential, 18 knots over standard combat power. He submitted the report to his squadron commander, Major Frank Drury. He recommended that the setting be tested and, if validated, adopted across the squadron. Drury read it. He called Lindbergh into his tent. He told him the report was impressive, thorough, well-reasoned. He also told him it was dangerous. Not the flying. The recommendation. If word got back to Group that a squadron was authorizing pilots to exceed manufacturer specifications, there would be an immediate investigation. Technical orders existed for a reason. Engines didn't just fail. They failed catastrophically. Propellers didn't just malfunction. They disintegrated and sent blades through cockpits. Drury asked Lindbergh if he was willing to stake his career on a hunch. Lindbergh told him it wasn't a hunch. It was data. Drury said data didn't matter if a pilot died, and the Board of Inquiry found unauthorized modifications in the maintenance logs. The conversation ended without resolution. Drury filed the report. He didn't forbid Lindbergh from using the setting himself, but he didn't authorize anyone else to try it. Lindbergh went back to flying, but he didn't stop testing. August brought a shift in the air campaign. Intelligence indicated a major Japanese offensive building in the central Solomons, increased reconnaissance flights, more bomber sorties, Zeros appearing in larger formations and with greater aggression. Henderson's squadrons were flying maximum sortie rates, and the fatigue was showing. Maintenance crews worked around the clock. Pilots flew 2 and sometimes 3 missions a day. Lindbergh's flight was scrambled on the morning of August 14th. 6 Corsairs. Mission: intercept a formation of Betty bombers reported inbound toward Munda Airfield. The weather was poor, visibility limited. They climbed through a deck of clouds at 4,000 feet and emerged into hazy sunlight. The bombers appeared at 12 o'clock, slightly below, 18 of them in tight formation, and above them stepped up in layers, at least 24 Zeros. It was a trap. The Bettys were bait. Drury, leading the flight, called it off. He ordered the formation to break and dive back into the clouds, but the Zeros had already seen them. They rolled in, slashing down from altitude with the sun behind them. The engagement dissolved into chaos. 6 Americans against 20-plus Japanese. No altitude advantage, no numerical superiority, just speed and firepower against maneuverability and experience. Lindbergh found himself alone within the first 30 seconds. His wingman had been separated in the initial bounce. The radio was a mess of overlapping calls and static. He reversed hard, trying to get eyes on the threat, and saw 2 Zeros positioning for a high-side gun pass. He dove. The Corsair accelerated like a stone. The Zeros followed, but they couldn't match the dive speed. Lindbergh bottomed out at 2,000 feet, pulled hard on the stick, and felt the G-forces crush him into the seat. His vision narrowed. The plane groaned, but it held together. He leveled out and pushed the throttle to the stop. Then he reached for the propeller control and shoved it into the course setting he'd been testing for weeks. The engine note changed. The plane leapt forward. The Zeros tried to follow. They were faster in a climb, better in a turn, but in straight-line speed at low altitude, the modified Corsair was simply gone. Lindbergh extended to the south, gained separation, then climbed back toward the fight. When he arrived, 3 of the 6 Corsairs were missing. The remaining 2 were defensive, trying to disengage. Lindbergh keyed the radio and called them to follow him. He led them on a high-speed exit vector, propeller still set beyond limits, engines screaming. The Zeros pursued for 5 miles, then turned back. All 3 Americans made it to Henderson. 2 landed with battle damage. One pilot had taken a round through the canopy that missed his head by inches, but they were alive. During the debrief, Drury asked how Lindbergh had managed to outrun the pursuit. Lindbergh told him. Drury said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked if any of the other pilots had tried the setting. They hadn't. They'd been flying by the book. That night, Drury called a meeting with his flight leaders. He laid out the situation. Losses were mounting. Tactical options were narrowing. The enemy had numerical parity, and, in certain scenarios, performance advantages that doctrine alone couldn't overcome. He presented Lindbergh's data, the tests, the measured results, the risk assessment. He made it clear that he wasn't ordering anyone to adopt the modification, but he was authorizing it. Any pilot who wanted to test the course pitch setting under supervision and with full engine monitoring had permission to do so. Within a week, half the squadron was using it. The mechanics, led by Magruder, developed a protocol. Pre-flight inspections focused on propeller hub integrity. Post-flight checks included detailed engine log entries. Cylinder head temperatures were tracked across missions. Any deviation from normal parameters triggered an immediate teardown and inspection. No failures occurred, but the performance gains were undeniable. Pilots reported faster engagement speeds, better disengagement capability, and increased confidence in defensive situations. The modification didn't make the Corsair invincible. It didn't turn average pilots into aces, but it gave them an edge, a margin, a few extra knots that translated into a few extra seconds, and in aerial combat, seconds were everything. Word spread. Other squadrons heard rumors. Pilots swapped stories during briefings at Espiritu Santo. Mechanics talked shop over coffee and cigarettes. By September, 3 other Marine squadrons were quietly testing the same modification. And then, inevitably, someone at Group heard about it. An order came down. All non-standard propeller settings were to cease immediately. A formal investigation was launched. Technical representatives from Pratt and Whitney were flown in to inspect engines and interview pilots. Maintenance logs were audited. Drury was called to a meeting with the group commander. Lindbergh expected a court-martial. Instead, he was summoned to give testimony, not as a defendant, as an expert. The Pratt and Whitney engineers listened to his data. They examined the engines that had been running the modified setting. They found no appreciable wear beyond normal parameters, no metallurgical stress, no indication of impending failure. What they found was a conservative safety margin that had been built into the specifications to account for worst-case scenarios that didn't exist in the controlled environment of a well-maintained frontline squadron. One of the engineers, a man named Holloway, asked Lindbergh why he'd thought the margin was exploitable. Lindbergh told him that he hadn't thought of it as exploiting a margin. He'd thought of it as using the full capability of a tool that someone else had designed, but never tested under the conditions it was actually being used. Holloway made notes. He asked more questions. He conferred with his team. 2 weeks later, a revised technical order was issued. The course pitch setting, previously unauthorized, was now officially approved for use in combat situations at altitudes below 10,000 feet, with specific guidelines for engine monitoring and maintenance intervals. It wasn't called the Lindbergh modification. It was listed in the manual as propeller setting C3. But every pilot and mechanic knew where it came from. The impact was measurable within a month. Loss rates for Corsairs in disengagement scenarios dropped by 19%. Pilots reported increased success in boom and zoom attacks, as the higher top speed allowed for faster setup and cleaner exits. Squadron readiness improved because fewer planes were being lost to attrition. The modification spread beyond the Solomons. Corsair squadrons in the Central Pacific began adopting it. Navy carrier groups tested it and found similar results. By early 1944, setting C3 was standard operating procedure across the Fleet Marine Force. The numbers told the story. In the 6 months following the authorization of the course pitch setting, Corsair units recorded a cumulative increase in mission effectiveness ratings and a corresponding decrease in combat losses. It wasn't the only factor. Improved tactics, better intelligence, and increasing numerical superiority all played roles. But the modification contributed measurably to the shifting balance of the air war. Lindbergh flew through the rest of 1943 and into 1944. He accumulated 14 confirmed kills and received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Not for the modification, but for actions in combat. The citation made no mention of propeller settings or unauthorized testing. It praised his courage, his skill, and his devotion to duty. He never sought recognition for the technical work. In interviews after the war, he described it as an obvious adjustment that any engineer would have noticed. He deflected praise toward Magruder and the other mechanics who validated the modification and ensured its safe implementation. Magruder, for his part, said that Lindbergh had done what good officers were supposed to do. He'd listened to the people who worked on the machines, trusted the data over the manual, and taken responsibility for the outcome. The course pitch setting became one of dozens of small incremental improvements that collectively transformed American air power in the Pacific. Individual modifications rarely won battles, but they accumulated, they compounded, they turned theoretical advantages into practical dominance. In 1945, after the war ended, Pratt and Whitney conducted a comprehensive review of engine performance data collected from combat operations. They found that frontline units had independently developed over 40 modifications to standard operating procedures, most of them minor, many of them undocumented, all of them aimed at extracting more capability from existing equipment. The review concluded that rigid adherence to peacetime engineering standards, while prudent for safety and logistics, often failed to account for the ingenuity and adaptability of operators under combat stress. It recommended closer collaboration between design engineers and frontline personnel. It was a lesson that would be forgotten and relearned in every subsequent conflict. Lindbergh returned to Ohio in late 1945. He went back to work for the farm equipment company. He married, he raised 2 children. He didn't talk much about the war, except when asked directly, and even then he focused on the people he'd flown with rather than the things he'd done. In 1953, he was invited to speak at a Pratt and Whitney symposium on combat engine performance. He gave a short presentation on the course pitch modification, emphasizing the collaboration between pilots and mechanics and the importance of field testing under operational conditions. The audience, mostly engineers, asked technical questions. He answered them precisely, without embellishment. At the end of the session, Holloway, the engineer who'd been part of the original investigation, approached him. They hadn't spoken in 10 years. Holloway thanked him. He said the lessons from that modification had influenced how the company designed testing protocols for the next generation of engines. He said it had saved lives. Lindbergh nodded. He said he was glad the data had been useful. Holloway asked if he'd ever regretted pushing outside the manual. Lindbergh said no. He said the manual was a starting point, not an ending point. He said engineering was about understanding systems well enough to know when the assumptions behind the rules no longer applied. He died in 1998, at the age of 78. His obituary in the Dayton Daily News mentioned his service in the Pacific and his work in agricultural machinery. It did not mention propeller settings or the 18 knots that changed how a generation of pilots fought and survived. But in the archives of the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, there's a preserved Corsair with setting C3 marked on the propeller control placard. Next to it, a small placard reads, Field Modification, 1943, developed by frontline personnel to increase combat effectiveness. No names, no drama. Just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the most important innovations come not from labs or boardrooms, but from individuals who understand their tools well enough to see what they're truly capable of. The war was won by production, by logistics, by the collective effort of millions. But within that vast machinery, there were moments when a single person's curiosity, discipline, and willingness to question authority made a tangible difference. Lindbergh's contribution didn't turn the tide of the Pacific War, but it gave hundreds of pilots a few extra seconds, a few extra knots, a margin that meant they came home. In the end, that's what ingenuity in war often looks like, not a dramatic breakthrough, not a singular act of genius, but a careful observation, a methodical test, and the courage to trust data over doctrine when lives are on the line. The lesson isn't that rules should be broken, it's that rules should be understood deeply enough to know when they're incomplete, when the assumptions behind them no longer match the reality in front of you, when the gap between the manual and the mission becomes a matter of life and death. Charles Lindbergh II never sought fame. He sought precision. And in a war defined by chaos, precision was its own form of heroism. His legacy isn't in medals or monuments. It's in the quiet knowledge, passed down through generations of aviators, that the plane has more to give if you're willing to listen to it, test it, and trust your instruments over your fear. 18 knots. That's all it took. 18 knots, and the willingness to be wrong if the data said otherwise. And because of that, men who should have died came home instead.